We welcome you to this lecture forum. Our honored guest this afternoon is the author of so many books and articles that we have to devote another lecture just to their enumeration. But by way of introduction, Man, Economy, and State, Power and Market. What has government done to our money? For a New Liberty, America's Great Depression, the Panic of 1819, and he's presently completing the 5th volume of his 5-volume work on American colonial and revolutionary periods conceived in liberty. He's without a doubt a great historian, political scientist, and an economist extraordinaire. But when people read Professor Rothbard's works, especially his historical works, they get very disturbed. And there's a lot of disagreement among them, among other reasons, because they can't quite place him in any established school of historical interpretation. Some people think that he's part of this breed of new right historians, while others think he's closer to new left revisionists. But then, of course, they know he's in the great tradition of the Austrian school of economics, that he is in fact a free market anarchist, the so-called guru of the strange libertarian movement. But I think that there is no disagreement over the fact that our honored guest is truly a unique scholar. On behalf of the Undergraduate History Society and the NYU History Department, it is my distinct honor and pleasure to introduce to you Professor Murray Rothbard.
Thank you very much. It's true, I did seem to disturb a lot of people. You're right. I think it was Carl Begler who told me, a new left historian. Hoover studied on the left, and Ziegler, Robert Ziegler, in his overview of Hoover's scholarship a few years ago, mentioned me along with it. I was simply a soldier in the ranks of Hoover revisionism, and he singled me out as a very disturbing book, and he kept going on like that, as if he sort of had a fit in reading it. So I guess there must be something in your statement. I don't know exactly what it is. I should know if I can bottle it. At any rate, this is going to be a very bold talk. And since I'm roaming over, I'm going to try to roam over all of American history in a half hour, and presenting a new paradigm, new to many of you anyway, of interpreting American history. Obviously, I can't prove it in 45 minutes. Even longer times can be difficult to prove. It has to be, there's a lot of evidence obviously piling up. As a way of looking at different aspects of American history. The basic view of history in general, my basic view of history in general, not just American history, is a general contest between liberty and power. Now, the thing is, this is what being interested in the question of liberty and power, I singled this out as a problem. There are other. I'm not saying there are other aspects. I'm not saying there are not other aspects of history that are important. Simply, these are the aspects that I focus on, because I think they're the most interesting, most important. And in this contest between liberty and power, which ranges over all of history, European, Asian, or wherever, there's I find it very fruitful to consider Albert J. Nock as a libertarian theorist, social theorist, historian in the 1920s and 30s. Distinction he made between what he called social power and state power. But he called social power, when he defined social power, was simply the results of voluntary social interaction among people. In the market economy, these results are free exchanges, free market exchanges. And the capital equipment and prosperity it gives rise to. In non-market sense, it gives rise to civilization, art, science, friendship, all sorts of cultural expressions, all of which are voluntary interactions between people, all of which he defines as society, society being a label for an array of voluntary human interactions. So social power is what he calls the result of all this. The power over nature, power of civilization, culture, economic prosperity. In contrast to that, there's state power, which is power over people, force, coercion, the monopoly, the attempted monopoly of violence in a territorial area. Albert J. Nock took the basic Weberian definition of government as the state as a institution trying to obtain a monopoly of violence in a given territorial area. He changed it slightly, but with some significant impact. Namely, he said that the government is that institution, or the state is that institution, which tries to attain a monopoly of crime in its territorial area. Since its revenue and its first of all is rooted in taxation and organized theft, and it's what it does with it is generally also pushing people around in various ways. Now, you don't have to be a libertarian well, I should say, to complete that thought. Not then saw history. All of human history is essentially a race between social power and state power. In other words, social power creates a creative instrument. Social power is constantly creating prosperity, capital equipment, civilization, culture, and so forth. State power is parasitic and moves up to take charge of it, exploit it, control it, regulate it, repress it. So we have these two forces basically in world history, social power and state power, and the progressive periods in history are those where social power is able to spurt ahead of state power, such as the 18th and 19th centuries. The regressive periods in history are where the state is able to catch up at the state power, the social power, and cripple it, and such as most of the 20th century. Okay, so that's sort of a very brief overview. It get very specific. It turns out in American history, it happily turns out that this analysis of liberty versus power is not only should be important for almost every historian, because it's, in fact, it is the key, provides a key to most of American political development. As a matter of fact, and again, this is tough to pigeonhole me in any different school of historical thought. You're looking for three important paradigms in the last 20 years, which I think any historian, not just libertarian historian, should use to explain American history. The names of very disparate names of Balin, Kleppner, and Coco come immediately to mind. All of whom are very different, but all of whom, it seems to me, add to this particular libertarian paradigm. Now, in order to adopt a libertarian paradigm, by the way, you don't have to be a libertarian. That's, I think, should be important to point out. You can either be in favor of power and against liberty, or you can be indifferent to it. This is not the point. The point is that it seems to me this paradigm stands by itself as an explanatory device to explain what's going on in American history. Okay, to get to start off with in colonial history, the liberty versus power theme becomes very important from the very beginning. In the first place, we have a very disparate group of colonists coming out, obviously. Some of them come out to achieve liberty, to find liberty in various ways. Others come out for very different purposes. But since they come out in just a few people in a large continent, there's overall this is a great deal of diversity, a great deal of areas where libertarianism takes hold even without theory to expound it. I think, for example, it's pretty clear to me, anyway, that the Maine coast for about 100 years or so, and the North Carolina coast for about 30 or 40 years, in Albemarle, there's an anarchist situation. In other words, there's a lot of people around and no government. At least that's the way it appears. North Carolina fishermen and farmers basically fleeing from what they consider Virginia despotism. And the Maine fishermen sort of either I'm not sure if they were fleeing or not. Nobody knows too much about them. They were there as fishermen. They didn't have any governmental institutions. As I say, they haven't been studying much. I don't even know if they can be studying much, but I don't know if they bother about leaving documents. Which, of course, one of the problems of social history is that not everybody, especially if they don't have intellectuals, churches amongst them, bothers with documents. At any rate, it appears that they got along pretty well, and they were fairly prosperous. They had no government institutions. There did not seem to be any anarchy and violence rampant amongst them. More specifically, we know more about Rhode Island. The Rhode Island colonies were specifically founded as refugees from Massachusetts Bay despotism. We know a lot more about them. It has been shown, I know it least something was going on in historiography. I recognize that the attacks on Massachusetts Bay are no longer fashionable. That with after World War II, it became the ruling trend with Perry Miller and others to say that the Puritan divines of Massachusetts Bay were really great people, largely because they were quite learned. And they knew Greek and Latin and Hebrew and so forth. I will admit they're quite learned. I can see that at the very beginning. I really don't care. And it's a question of what your basic interests are. I still think they were tyrants and despots. And generally, it's conjured up in the word Puritan emerges. I think that they pioneered, certainly in America, they pioneered on the Chinese Communist bloc, bloc tyranny kind of thing. You point each block, a warden for each block to spy on their neighbors and report back to the church, and things of that nature. At any rate, so you have different religious revolutions, or revolts from, I shouldn't say revolutions, this descent from Massachusetts Bay and ejection of these people from the colony, starting with Roger Williams and Anne Hutchinson and others. In the course of their expressing their dissent, both in theory and practice, both Roger Williams and Anne Hutchinson arrived at very libertarian expression theories, and also libertarian institutions when they got to Rhode Island. So we have at least quasi-anarchistic colonies in Rhode Island. Roger Williams was the most radical and the most libertarian in the period, in his early period, when he was also in touch with the levelers, who were, at that point, winning in the English Civil War. And it's one thing is we have to remember is that even though it took a long time to go back and forth across the ocean, most of these people traveled quite a bit. And so Williams made several trips to England, and he made the trip where when the levelers were almost winning, right, dominant at the point, greatly influenced his libertarian direction. It's no accident, I think, when Williams got more conservative and more statist, if you want to put it, later on. It was also during the period when Cromwell had already taken over and wiped out the levelers and installed his own particular despotism. So that in theory and practice, Williams then gets, either for pragmatic reasons or just because he was giving up, gets more and more statist, starts talking about the ship of state, has to have a helmsman and all that stuff. As he begins to violate his own religious liberty principles. At any rate, he's certainly the first religious, he certainly applied, until quite late in his life, he applied religious libertarianism quite thoroughly. He got pretty aggravated when the Quakers came in, because he thought they were going a little too far and making disrespectful authority. But by that time, as I say, he was getting older and more conservative. And Anne Hutchinson was the second major dissenter. He was also kicked out of Massachusetts Bay. And both of them, by the way, separately, both Williams and Hutchinson walked all the way from Massachusetts to Rhode Island, which to me, still in the middle of the winter, to me, still I can't understand how they did it. It must be much more hardy than I am. They were walking, there were no roads, don't forget, let alone planes, highways, buses. And they walked to Rhode Island and set up their own colony. At any rate, Anne Hutchinson, in the course of also coming out with a religious position of religious liberty, also, and when she set up her own colony, got disillusioned with her own ally, William Connington, was sort of the head of the colony, because he was getting too despotic too. And she then concluded that not only is it illegitimate for the magistrate to intervene in religion, the magistrate being a general term for government, it's also illegitimate for the magistrate to do anything at all, to intervene with anybody in any area. In other words, she's, I think, fair to say she's the first American anarchist. And so there was, and after she left for New York and got killed in the midst of an Indian uprising, so to speak, her tradition was carried on by her sister, Mrs. Catherine Scott. And by the way, I don't understand why the feminist historians haven't resurrected these people. They were extremely heroic people as well as being libertarian. Her sister, Mrs. Catherine Scott, then carried on, founded the first. She and others founded the first Baptist church in America. They were all anarchists. They were known as the Baptist anarchists. Again, very little is known about their ideological views. The one thing it hasn't been fashionable to study them. So I'm not sure if you did study them, what we'd find. At any rate, it seems to be fairly clear. And also Roger Williams' own brother became fairly anarchistic, Robert Williams, and engaged in rebellion against Rogers. And Roger was beginning to abandoned the libertarian doctrine. Rebellion, of course, was put down. But at any rate, there was a constant ferment, libertarian ferment, both in theory and practice. The most charming example, to me, the most charming example of anarchistic institutions in colonial America was in Pennsylvania. The Evelyn Bronner book, God's Holy Experiment, I think, goes into some detail. And basically what it is that for that period, Pennsylvania was quite populous, about 10,000 more people, and largely Quaker. And William Penn, after having set up the institution, went back to England and expected to collect his quit rents and his taxes, since he claimed to own the whole territory and also was the head of the colony. And it turned out that he wasn't getting them. And so Bronner goes in a whole charming story about Penn counting the desk and, well, where are my taxes, where are my quit rents, and they're coming out. So that it turns out that Pennsylvania was more or less pretty anarchistic. I would say very close to anarchism for about 30 years altogether. There were a couple of periods of hiatus. There were no taxes being collected. I think his name was Lloyd, William Lloyd. He was the keeper of the Great Seal, and part of the Pennsylvania Charter was no legislative action or any action at all could be done without the Great Seal being stamped on the proceeding. He refused to stamp refused to use the stamp of the Great Seal, and so this effectively brought the government of Pennsylvania to a halt. No taxes were collected. There were very few local taxes, and local justices only met a couple of weeks a year. So in effect, there was virtually no government for quite a while. And again, there was no report of rapine, looting, or anything of that sort. Everybody seemed to be quite peaceful and very, in fact, happy with the situation. And so when Penn tried to restore the taxes in the government, he was not successful, and finally sent John Blackwell, a tough Puritan, which must have been a difficult thing for Penn to do, since he was violating his own Quaker principles and thwarting a Puritan to try to collect taxes and reimpose government. And so the charming story, I can go on about it, I won't take too much time, but the great story, I think one of the great stories of American history is when Blackwell arrives in New York from England. He sends a message to Philadelphia that he's going to arrive as the new governor of Pennsylvania. Everybody should come out in the street to meet him with brass bands and whatever. And he arrives and there's nobody there. And there's only a few small boys to throw pebbles at him. So this is a great way. This is the way the libertarians, of course, in the state should always be treated. So Blackwell's getting increasingly incensed, and he goes to the city hall. He finds out it's all locked, and there's cobwebs there. The records of government haven't been used for many years, and nobody's collecting taxes. He starts issuing orders, and nobody obeys them. Generally, he's totally frustrated. Finally, has to go home. It's one of the great anarchistic victories. Eventually, of course, the king, the crown reimposes control after the 1690s, etc. But even later, but for a while there, for about, say, 20, 30 years, it was essentially an anarchistic situation. And I'd say there didn't seem to be anybody, everybody seemed to enjoy it a great deal. There didn't seem to be anybody really in favor of ending it. There was also an enormous number of tax rebellions going on all over the place, in almost every colony. Another very charming thing, which hasn't been studied much. I tried to do as much as I could find in my own work, but it's just scratching the surface. The paradigmatic case, and there's a lot in New Jersey, I remember, for example. The paradigmatic case is somebody refuses to pay his local taxes, some farmer. Then the sheriff goes out and confiscates his cow in lieu of payment. He gets together with his brother or whatever and goes and liberates the cow from the local pokey, using whatever necessary violence is entailed in liberating your cow. Then the local government gets sore and they mobilize the posse and so forth to go out and get the guy and arrest him. He then mobilizes and they do arrest him. His neighbors then organize and they free him and liberate him. This is constantly going on all the time. It's magnificent. It's just a great tradition of local tax rebellion all over the place. Okay, so after having a sort of an seems to me a very anarchistic kind of heritage in the 17th century. It doesn't mean all the colonies obviously were that way, but there are a lot of them, enough to make an imprint. Then after the Whig settlement was imposed around 1700, 1710, we have a much more uniform kind of political system in the colonies. We then have a great new institution coming in, a very interesting new interplay of theory and institution. In the first place, we have, to me, another remarkable kind of situation. We have the Whig settlement, the Whig Party in England, essentially dominated by magnates, big landlords, and big monopoly merchants, trying to impose mercantilism through the empire. Okay. We have at the head of the Whig Party a master politician, brilliant politician, one of the most brilliant politicians ever, Robert Walpole, with his assistant, the Duke of Newcastle, and his brother, Henry Pelham. So these three guys essentially were laissez-faire people, completely opposed to mercantilism, in favor of minimal government, free trade, minimal taxes, and international peace, which was very difficult to maintain because one of the big Whig programs was to crush the French menace. To crush France forever and grab its empire. So Walpole was under constant pressure, of course, by the pro-war and mercantilist Whigs to get moving, oppose mercantilist legislation and declare and make war upon France. So he's able, however, to keep them at bay by several mechanisms. Walpole. He's able to run this whole thing sitting on top of, I liken it as sitting on top of a volcano for about 20, 30 years before he's finally kicked out. He's able to do it by running Parliament through a system of corruption, through creating phony places, so to speak, rotten boroughs, contracts, phony, the equivalent in the Bronx of pothole inspectors. The king's assistant pothole inspector for $10,000 a year or something, essentially doing nothing, and buying off a large chunk of Parliament in that way. Is able to keep things running. He's also, what he does on the American front, is he passes all this mercantilist legislation to restrict American navigation, restrict manufacture and trade and all the rest of it, and he just doesn't enforce it. So the Whigs are happy because they pass all the legislation, and the Americans are happy because they're not enforcing it. The Duke of Newcastle, a charming figure, is his aide-de-camp of this, who kind of wanted to sleep most of the time. His conception of Wolf was supposed to hire your relatives and snooze, do nothing. And also a laissez-faire person. So there's a great alliance, the Pelhamite alliance. Essentially, obviously, in the long run, couldn't work because it had no mass base. But it did work for a couple of generations. So this kind of master political strategies. So we have then this mercantilist legislation which wasn't being enforced. Then, as Balin has pointed out in detail, in the internal situation, in each colony, even though there's supposed to be a royal governor, the royal appointed governor, upper council, the assemblies, the elected assemblies, were able to take the power away from the governors, largely by the charming device of not paying their salary when the governor shapes up. The salaries are being paid for by the colonial assemblies, who had to levy the internal taxes to do it. So this power of the purse, this threat not to pay salaries, gradually brought the governors to heel and made the assembly dominant. Okay, so we then had, by the middle of the 18th century, a de facto independent America. Not de jure, certainly, but in de facto in large part. Americans enjoyed the situation enormously. Okay. In the meantime, we had, as again Balin has pointed out, we have Americans become increasingly influenced by a whole bunch of radical theorists. And here again, this is, to me, one of the most interesting things that Balin has achieved, is to show that sort of the actual mechanism, so to speak, by which American ideology was formed and adopted. In the old days, we thought that Americans, the older historians, early 19th century, thought that Americans all read John Locke, or they were steeped in niceties of constitutional law. It didn't sound right. It didn't sound right that everybody is sitting around reading John Locke. I mean, it just doesn't square with our knowledge of human nature. Okay, so there seems to be something missing there. And what Balin accomplished, seems to me, essentially, is to put in a missing term, namely that it's not that the masses read John Locke, it's that a lot of radical writers read John Locke, and the masses read them. In other words, the intellectuals who radicalized John Locke and put Locke in less abstract, more concrete, and more hopped-up language. And they were read. Cato's Letters being the dominant one of these, a whole bunch of others. Now, it seems to me, again, that with Cato's Letters, the Commonwealth men, or the radical opposition in the 18th century in England, read very heavily by Americans, reprinted all over the place in newspaper form and pamphlets. Plus the tradition not only of Locke, but also of Algernon Sidney, the Republican martyr who was executed by Charles II when he was restored to the throne, and gave one of these great deathbed, not deathbed, execution bed, I guess the term, speeches. I don't know exactly how they did that either. It was a great tradition, apparently, to give you a great speech just before your head is chopped off, just before you're hanged. I wouldn't be able to do it. So anyway, Sidney gives this great speech to the hand of tyranny, this hand of tyranny ever strike the blow, and became a Republican, a martyr of republicanism. Okay, so we had, it seems to me, again, trying to interpret the American revolutionaries and imbibed Bergen and Cato's letters and Sidney and all these other people, the Commonwealth men, that it seems to me that libertarians are positioned in the sense that understand them better than other people, because many other historians get confused about these people, about the American revolutionaries. Were they interested in political rights? Were they interested in personal freedom? Were they interested in constitutional rights? Or were they interested in economics, private property? Were they against taxes, or were they in favor of liberty? Most historians imbibe whatever culture they grow up in. Most historians now can't see the two are these things are all integrated in the thought, at least of these 18th century revolutionaries. It's not integrated in their thought. The thought of the historians, most of whom either choose liberty or property or neither. But it was integrated in the thought of these American revolutionaries because, indeed, they were largely libertarian. And in other words, they thought, to them, economic liberty, property liberty, personal liberty, constitutional attack on imperialism, all these things were integrated. They're all part of the same libertarian doctrine. Life, liberty, and property was not a sort of a vague term. It was the concrete ideologies and actions on their part. So whether they're right or not, whether you agree with them or not, the point is they believe these things are conjoined. They saw no difference between a tax rebellion and a rebellion for liberty against the crown, or rebellion for liberty against despotism. To them, it's all part of the same framework. Taxes are a despotic act. They interfere not only with property but with liberty at the same time. Okay, I want to read. I don't want to read too much, but I love Cato's letters. I want to read a little bit of it because it shows, I think, the flavor of the sort of stuff the Americans were imbibing at the time, throughout the 18th century. Cato's letters were written by John Trenchard and Thomas Gordon in the early 1720s. It seems pretty clear, by the way, that Trenchard was the important guy there, because after he died, Gordon sort of changed his position, which seems to indicate that Trenchard was a major person here. They, by the way, they were in an interesting position. They were radical libertarians opposing Walpole's regime because they didn't like the corruption. They agreed with Walpole's policies of laissez-faire, peace, and so forth. They didn't like the whole engine of parliamentary corruption that was taking place. So they attacked it from the so-called left, which in those days meant more libertarian. Okay, this is just to read a little bit, just to show the flavor of the sort of things Americans were imbibing from Cato's letters. All men are born free. Liberty is a gift which they receive from God himself, nor can they alienate the same by consent, although possibly they may forfeit it by crimes. The right of the magistrate arises only from the right of private men to defend themselves, to repel injuries, and to punish those who commit them. That right being conveyed by the society to the public representative, he can execute the same no further than the benefit and security of that society requires he should. When he exceeds his commission, and when the government goes beyond this very narrow area of self-defense, his acts are as extrajudicial as are those of any private officer usurping unlawful authority. That is, they are void. Every man is answerable for the wrong which he does. It's fantastic. The power to do good can never become a warrant for doing evil. In other words, you apply to the government the same moral laws you apply to everybody else. This is basically, by the way, that sums up a libertarian position, in contrast to other people. We believe that government should be accountable in the same way as other institutions and other people. Okay, then Cato goes on to talk about the blessings of liberty. From liberty flow all sorts of happiness, security, harmony, prosperity, and so forth. And then, in this idol of liberty, however, there's always the threat of encroachments of power, that is government. And here, by the way, there's a difference between Cato and radical libertarians on one hand and Locke on the other. And Locke is talking abstractly. Locke says, whenever the government goes beyond these bounds of defensive, laissez-faire personal property, then it's legitimate to overthrow it. Then it's evil and it could be overthrown. The Cato people said the same thing, and then they go on to say, government is always trying to encroach on liberty. This encroachment is always there. The inherent tendency of power is constantly to encroach on liberty and rights, and therefore, government should always be treated with enormous hostility and eternal vigilance, because the government is always ready, sort of like a cancer. They don't use the analogy. That's basically it. So that There's another term there in the Lockean syllogism, but mainly, and the government's always trying to encroach on liberties. It's a much more radical position than Locke himself. Okay, to continue on here, there's always a threat of government in this ideal of liberty. Quote, only the checks put upon magistrates make nations free, and only the want of such checks makes them slaves. They are free where their magistrates are confined within certain bounds set them by the people, and they are slaves where the magistrates choose their own rules and follow their lusting humors, than which a more dreadful curse can befall no people. And therefore most nations of the world are undone, and those nations only who bridle their governors and not wear chains. And he goes on about rulers, a magnificent attack on power and rulers. We know by infinite examples and experience that men possessed of power, rather than part with it, will do anything, even the worst and the blackest, to keep it. And scarce ever any man upon earth went out of it as long as he could carry everything his own way in it. This seems certain that the good of the world or of their people was not one of their motives either for continuing in power or for quitting it. It is the nature of power to be ever encroaching and converting every extraordinary power, granted at particular times and upon particular occasions, into an ordinary power to be used at all times and when there is no occasion. Nor does it ever part willingly with any advantage. Madison was supposed to originate this thing about extraordinary power, obviously not. It's part of the political culture of the time. And it goes on about tyrants reduce mankind to the condition of brutes and make that reason which God gave them useless to them. They deprive them even of the blessings of nature, starve them in the midst of plenty, and frustrate the natural bounty of the earth to men. So that nature smiles in vain where tyranny frowns. On and on, it's a magnificent declamation. And finally, they say, at last, power encroaches daily upon liberty, with success too evident, the balance between them is almost lost. Tyranny has engrossed almost the whole earth, and striking at mankind root and branch makes the world a slaughterhouse. And will certainly go on to destroy until it is either destroyed itself, or, which is most likely, has left nothing else to destroy. Okay, this is powerful stuff. And say the Americans are imbibing it with great enthusiasm. And they go on to apply to the Britain of their day, the British government of their day. The Americans love that also, maybe even more. And it's like, okay, so the Americans then imbibe, and they're de facto free, and they imbibe this, not only its libertarian position, but also constant hatred of government, constant suspicion, or as Bale himself would say, paranoia. I don't agree with that terminology. The point is, it's a paranoia which is obviously justified in most cases. So then, as Nollenberg has pointed out, others historians, when the British then start, after Walpole is kicked out, Newcastle's are kicked out, Pelham's are kicked out, and the British conquer the French Empire, and the 7 Years' War is over, and the British turn around and say, where's our damn empire? Why aren't the Americans paying taxes? Why are they snuggling under? And the British then begin their grand design to reduce America to despotism, step by step. To have an army, to impose taxes, to reimpose the Mercantilist Acts, to station an army here to enforce it, and all the rest of it. They do it step by step. They don't want to alarm the Americans. And because the Americans were infected with so-called paranoia, in other words, because they have healthy suspicion of the aims of state power, they immediately came to the conclusion that there's a plot here at work, there's a grand design, therefore we have to battle it, we have to resist it to any extent necessary. And stamp back as a result of that. As Nollenberg points out, we now know that the paranoia was correct. Now the archives are open. We now know the British officials were writing to each other saying, okay, here's what we're going to do. We're going to do A, B, C in order to impose our empire in America. But of course, at the time, the archives weren't open. The archives are never open, immediately on the spot. So you have to act on your best knowledge. The Americans act on their best knowledge because they were libertarians. There's deep suspicions of the state power, in general, and British in particular. So, all right, so then we have, as a result of this, we have the well-known revolutionary movement and outbreak, I don't have to detail. Except to say, again, liberty and property, to them, the attack on taxes, the attack on the state apparatus and monopoly is all part of the same approach. The attack on the dumping of tea in Boston Harbor was attacked at the same time on government monopoly privilege, which was the privilege of the East India Company, and on taxes. To them, they were all one thing. Okay, I'm coming to the next, I think, important point to mention as a libertarian revolution. If it was a libertarian revolution, what went wrong? Did it go wrong? Obviously, something went wrong somewhere. And it seems to me the seeds of what went wrong happened during the war itself. And here again, we have an enormous amount of new historical information brought about because of the success of guerrilla warfare in the last 15, 20 years or so. So the people like Shy and Higginbottom and so forth have then reassessed the military aspect of the American Revolution with completely different eyes, because realizing something more at work than ragged militia and all that sort of thing. And so here I think we have to again build on the insights of the guerrilla question, American Revolution. It seems to me, in looking at the Revolutionary War, that there's a one-to-one correlation, almost without exception, between victory by American forces in battle and the use of guerrilla warfare, and tactics and strategy. And on the other hand, not using guerrilla warfare and being smashed. Charles Lee was to libertarians, or almost I think any historian, Charles Lee is a fascinating figure. The unsung hero of the American Revolution does not get monuments raised to him. Again, a fascinating figure. He was a British radical. He was a military genius. No question about that. He was a British radical. He was hip deep in radical criticism of George III during a radical Whig position before the war. And he wandered around Europe fighting and participating in different warfare, and it came to a very important guerrilla kind of conclusion. He was the first great theorist of guerrilla warfare. As far as I can see, he was the founder of, for example, the concept of people's war. Not, I'll say, Castro or Che, but Charles Lee. And wrote many tracts, wrote several important pamphlets expounding his doctrines. When he found out that and one great moment, again, one great thing happened. He was, George III passed him over for promotion in the army. He got an audience with George III, marched into his office, marched into his chambers, and denounced him, said he was a blackguard or whatever, betrayed his trust and walked out. This is not something one did. Don't forget it was no First Amendment in England at that period. It was a rather courageous thing to do. Anyway, it's typical of Charles Lee. So when he finds out about the Boston Tea Party coming up, the revolutionary ferment, he immediately rushes to America to participate in it. He was, in a sense, the world's first professional revolutionary. And he impresses everybody tremendously with American leadership, revolutionary leadership, tremendously with his acumen. We get to, without getting to the details of the battles or anything, the most important, the best generals in America were essentially Lee's disciples. Horatio Gates was a friend of Lee in England, also came over, emigrated here before the war. Nathaniel Greene was essentially a Lee disciple, and Daniel Morgan and the rest of the two basic ways to fight the war, which became politically important and militarily important. One was, to say, the guerrilla warfare, sort of the natural method, which won us the Battle of Lexington and Concord. Spontaneous uprisings like American militia, farmers. Fighting a people's war, fighting on the spot, fighting close to their homes, fighting at night, stressing mobility, popping the officers behind trees and rocks. There's nothing to say to do in those days. You're supposed to march out on an open field, you have firepower, kneel down with muskets, and at the officer's bidding, you fire. You're never supposed to shoot the officer. It's considered an ungentlemanly thing to do. So, I mean, using the new rifle, this new instrument, which is good, bad on firepower, but very good for aiming, so you can aim at the officers. There's this this kind of guerrilla warfare required very little in the way of taxation or inflation or government finance. Because you just go out there, you have your rifle anyway, you go out there and do your thing, go home, and you corral the roads at night. It's essentially the typical guerrilla kind of action. You capture the roads at night, you're mobile, you know the terrain, you have the people with you, so you're not turned in. In fact, the position of the British Army is turned into you, and all that is expounded. Okay, so and then there was the other concept of warfare, which was the orthodox 18th century warfare. You build an army, you have taxes, you get the guys in there for long enlistments, keep them there for a couple of years, you drill them, you go out there on the field, you pop up the muskets in the usual traditional 18th century manner. This was the George Washington tactic. The Baron von Steuben, the phony German adventurer, came over to drill the troops. And Washington hated the idea of being a bandit chieftain, as he could be called. He wanted a real army out there, the real state apparatus running it. And so you have these two conflicting ways of running an army. What we did, of course, was both. We lost all the orthodox battles. We won all the guerrilla battles, which is the reason why Washington lost every battle he was engaged in, with the exception of Trenton and Princeton, the only time he adopted guerrilla tactics. He surprised the drunken Hessians on Christmas. And that was it. And then Yorktown, he was finally persuaded to go down to Yorktown. He didn't even want to go there. He thought thought you should attack New York instead. At any rate, without going into the details of that, the point is that Washington was a total dodo, plus being interested in building up the state apparatus. So at the end of the war, we emerged from the war, the Revolutionary War, these two strains, two motifs, emerged with decentralized militia, we also emerged with national state army. And we emerged with a group of nationalists trying desperately to reimpose the British system without Britain, which becomes the nationalist program, which later becomes called the Federalist program. We then launch a series of titanic political struggles, which really continue from then on, between the so-called anti-federalists, which were essentially the libertarian heirs of the original revolutionary theory, and the centralists or nationalists who want to build up a strong state. Build up a strong state in order to have strong public debt, pay off the public debt which exists, have high taxes, big army, big navy to open up markets abroad, high tariffs to subsidize manufacturers, and large public works, a central bank to organize inflation, and promote cheap credit to the political friends of the central nationalists. It's a total mercantilist program, and it's an English program without England. I think it's pretty clear these guys are a minority, the nationalists. They were able to put through the Constitution, which was essentially a nationalist coup d'etat, largely because, well, for various reasons. One thing, they were able to get an alliance with the urban craftsmen, the urban self-employed urban artisans at the time, because they become inefficient during the war. They were sheltered from competition from English manufactured products. And so when the war was over, imports came in, they began to be outcompeted. They began to go to the wall. So they sought to protect their tariff to preserve their inefficient production. So we have these urban artisans provided sort of a mass base, the urban mass base for the Constitution. There was almost no mass base outside of urban areas. There were farmers on river banks, and here I think Jack Main's book on anti-federalists is excellent. It really indicates exactly who was for the Constitution and why, who was against it and why, and the tactics that the pro-Constitution people used to put it through. It was essentially a blitzkrieg tactics. It was done in the middle of winter, no roads. Don't forget there are no roads then. It's very difficult to communicate. They had control of the monopoly post office, which they inherited from Britain. The Federalists did, and they pushed through their letters and held up the letters of the opposition. And they used all sorts of tactics. This sort, they bought people out. There's a whole bunch of tactics of that sort. We wind up with a nationalist program, nationalists winning out with this blitzkrieg effort. And then, and by the way, I commend your attention tremendously to some of the speeches against the Constitution, such as Patrick Henry's in the Virginia Convention, ratifying convention. Bitter and magnificent attack by Patrick Henry on the Constitution, saying if you adopt this, you'll lose liberty, you'll lose the republic, you'll have power and empire. He's setting forth the power versus liberty theme and the empire versus republic theme. This will bring you, big government, bring you empire, and bring you power. You'll give up the republic. And other people said similar things. George Mason, the founder of the concept of the Bill of Rights, in fact, the Bill of Rights, period. And a whole bunch of other libertarian heroes, Abraham Yates in New York, and George Clinton, and many others. Jefferson was sort of a trimmer on the Constitution, which he's going to continue to be from then on. So it's very difficult because those of us who are Jeffersonians or interested in Jeffersonianism have to deal with Jefferson himself. By the way, this is another important point of historical analysis, namely that historians of thought, or even historians in general, tend to deal on the big shots, Jefferson versus Hamilton, or Machiavelli, or whatever. Usually the second-rank people are purer than the top people. The top people are usually selling out, the other. So the Jefferson, to understand the Jeffersonian movement and dealing only with Jefferson distorts the thing. The Jeffersonians themselves, the second-rank people, especially Macon and Randolph and Taylor, are much purer than Jefferson, much more Jeffersonian than Jefferson. It's constantly compromising, selling out, etc. So it's important to deal with second-rank people. And there's some historians who are doing that now. The temptation is always to have a quick fix. Jefferson, Hamilton, that's it. Wrap it up. So at any rate, the anti-federalists then try to push through a second constitutional convention. Their program was, look, this constitutional convention is a phony, it's a coup d'etat. Let's scrap it and have a second convention which would simply fix up the Articles of Confederation. prevent intrastate tariffs, between states, whatever. The threat of the Second Constitutional Convention was very real to the Nationalists. They're very worried about this. And so Madison, wily opportunist, if there was one, decides, okay, we'll give them their damn Bill of Rights, something which he was hated like blazes to do. So that was essentially the deal, which then fixed American history from then on. The Anti-Federalists got their Bill of Rights, which is a libertarian document from the word go, and the Nationalists got their Constitution, the text of the Constitution, which is an anti-libertarian document. If you read the text of the Constitution and you read the 10 Amendments, they read as if they're written by two different sets of people, which indeed they were. The text of the Constitution says Congress shall have a power to X, Y, Z. Interstate commerce clause, general welfare, all these things, by the way, were put in deliberately to expand state power. They're not loopholes discovered later on. And the Bill of Rights saying Congress may not do such and such, the government may not do such, may not interfere with rights. They're written by two different sets of people. And this sets up then the tension for American history and American history from then on. The tension between the nationalists on one hand and libertarians on the other. And both sides are stuck with this Constitution, so to speak. In a sense, the Anti-Federalists give up, I think strategically turned out to be wrong by giving up, by adopting a Constitution and then trying to limit it. And saying, okay, we have to strict construction of the power and broad construction of the Bill of Rights. Because eventually they lost that. Now, unfortunately, we're getting to be 5 o'clock, and I'm only up to the Constitution. But what then happens, it seems to me, is that the Federalists push through the Nationalist program. Jeffersonians attack it and say Jefferson himself was great as long as he was out of power. As soon as he got into power, he begins to adopt the emoluments of power, temptations of power. At any rate, the War of 1812 is something which is very important, which is again sort of overlooked by historians. We tend to rush to the Jackson era very quickly. The War of 1812 essentially, so that the protective tariff, a strong army and navy, the central bank, public works, even paper money, all of these are come in through put in by the Jeffersonians themselves. They adopt virtually the entire Federalist program. The Federalists themselves die out because of their opposition to the war. So we end up in the end of War of 1812. We have a very peculiar situation in America. We have a one-party system. A very dangerous situation, any one-party system is, with the Federalists essentially having won out, even though they themselves were the person that disappeared. At this point, it seems to me another very charming situation involves Jefferson himself, aging figure Monticello, is getting pretty bitter. It looks at what's happening, feels the spirit of 76, as it's called, the spirit of 98, the Kentucky, Virginia resolutions threatening to nullify the Alien Sedition Acts. This spirit had been dissipated, and we'd adopted federalism in the guise of republicanism. I don't think he blamed himself for this. I don't think he understood his own role in this. It's human nature. He certainly didn't like the result of this whole action. As he starts complaining about this to people who visit him and for weekends, it became a tradition for young aspiring politicians to visit him for weekends and imbibe the spirit of the revolution. And two conversions took place of extreme importance in American history. People visited on different weekends in Monticello. One was young Martin Van Buren, and the other was Thomas Hart Benton in Missouri. Both of whom came away with a real conversion experience from this weekend, saying, "My God, I didn't realize we have to take back America from the Federalists. We've lost the spirit of the revolution." And so Van Buren in particular is one of my, I think, a heroic figure in American history. Starts using all of his political wiles, which were considerable, starts to create a new party in the United States, which is a very difficult thing to do then and now, to take back America from this essential federalism. And he makes an alliance with the old Jeffersonians, an alliance with Benton in Missouri, and then finds a charismatic leader in the form of Andrew Jackson, and we essentially launch the Jacksonian era. Now, the Jacksonian era is another point which is difficult for non-libertarians to understand. I'm not saying it's impossible, it's just more difficult. Again, historians of the Jacksonian period have been arguing for a long time about what essentially were the Jacksonians. Were they hard money people? Were they agrarian radicals? Were they rising entrepreneurs? And all that. But they are essentially all of this because they were essentially libertarian. They believed they were in favor of entrepreneurship so long as it wasn't connected with the state. They were against special privilege and monopoly privilege in government. In favor of the free market. They read, by the way, mostly Jacksonian theorists, so they read the whole classical economists very, very closely. And They're believers in laissez-faire and hard money, which is meaning separation of money from the state, banking from the state. These are not contradictory notions. They might not be fashionable nowadays, but they were quite strong in those days. And again, it was an integrated both economic and political system that the Jacksonians offered. Essentially, they were Jeffersonians brought up to date. Okay, I don't want to leave the 19th century dealing with the Kleppner thesis. I think is very important because it sort of from the Kleppner thesis and the new political history which has come out in the last 9 years or so, we understand the mass base of political action, political parties in the United States. One of the things which always puzzled me as an economist is looking at 19th century history, either the Jackson period or the Bryan fights later on. How come so many Americans are passionately interested in economic issues, tariff and banking and gold and silver? I mean, I can't get my own students interested in it. They're a captive audience, and they have to sit there and get marks. And yet you have a massive public really interested in this stuff, writing pamphlets, and even people, illiterate people writing pamphlets. With burning interest in this. How did this happen? I've never, it seems to me only the Kleppner thesis provides a solution to this puzzle. Essentially, the Kleppner thesis, we boil it down again, very great oversimplification, is this, that it's something, in a sense, it's like the Balin explaining, it's not that they read John Locke in the American Revolutionary period, they read the intermediate people, they read the Cato's letters. Similarly, it's not that they started with, not that the Democrats or Republicans or Whigs before the Republicans, it's not that they started with deep interest in banking. They started with gut issue interests. They started interest in their local religious questions. They got most of their values from, certainly, originally from religious position, ethnic religious opposition. And so what you have throughout the entire 19th century, from the 1820s on, certainly from the revival evangelical movement on, up until through the 1920s and even now, but certainly through approximately the 1920s, you have two fundamental religio-political groups in the United States. You have what Kleppner calls the pietists. In his new book, which took me about three months to get a hold of now from the publisher, it's the Columbia Library, it's out. The Columbia Library is systematically ripped off by its inhabitants. At any rate, Kleppner, the current book now expands on this in some detail and adds more sophisticated or subtle analysis. But anyway, the basic point. We have two basic ethno-religious groups in the United States, ethno-political, which then get politically oriented. One is what he calls the pietists. And essentially the pietist framework means something like this, that each person is responsible for his own salvation, but in order to achieve salvation, he also has to achieve the good of the salvation of other people. This is a wing, especially in the New England wing of pietists, to achieve the good of other souls. That in order to do that, society has to minimize the conditions of temptation, try to maximize salvation. Since everybody's supposed to be responsible for the salvation of his brother or sister, they should minimize the conditions of temptation by outlawing, and the use of the state that is the arm of society, by outlawing conditions of temptation. Specifically, demon rum. The attack on alcohol is chronic, constant, and never ending. Okay? On the local level, state level, throughout the 19th century. Apparently, Kleppner's later book points out that it's connected with some kind of theory of free will. The demon rum, when people drink liquor, their free will is taken from them, and therefore they have to liquor has to be outlawed to save their free will. It's kind of an odd thesis for a libertarian to try to understand, but apparently that's it. Then you had, so that's the liquor. There's a constant attempt to outlaw liquor by the pietists. Secondly, an attempt to crush anything on Sunday which is not going to church and praying. Any non-church praying activity should be outlawed. Now, especially, of course, drinking liquor. So drinking liquor on Sunday, so to the pietists is the height of evil. Okay? And third, if you can't save the heathen, these heathens are immigrants are coming in from abroad who are not pietists. If you can't save the adults, get the kids. So it's important then to crush parochial schools and get the kids in the public school system so they can become good pietist Protestants. Okay, because in those days the public school system was essentially a Protestantizing device. Okay, that was essentially the pietist the pietist doctrine. On the other side are the liturgicals. Liturgical. Well, basically Catholics and also high Lutherans. And it was fascinating. I think Kleppner himself used to be a Lutheran seminarian. So it was a fascinating tables of voting records in the Middle West of showing different sects of Lutherans, who was more conservative, such as more liturgical, who was more pietist, different degrees of pietism. It shows a one-to-one correlation between the degrees of pietism and the Republican percentage of the Republican votes as compared to the Democratic votes. It's really fascinating stuff. At any rate, the liturgicals, meaning Catholics and High Lutherans, took a very different position. Their position was salvation comes through the church, through obeying the liturgy, or in the case of Orthodox Calvinists, obeying the creed. And that's about it. And the church is representative, responsible for personal salvation. And so if you want to be saved, you join the Catholic Church or Lutheran Church. Otherwise, that's the deal. They didn't put it in those terms. But there's no responsibility then for society to go out and save all these people against their will. The state becomes an outlaw of things. So essentially, the Catholics and Lutherans believe in a personal laissez-faire approach. On liquor, they were quite moderate. In fact, they enjoyed drinking liquor, basically, into moderation and so forth. And the German Lutherans, particularly German Catholics, a great tradition for them to drink beer on Sundays in beer gardens. So them outlawing liquor and also outlawing liquor on Sundays is a real pain in the neck, to say the least. So we have a situation where Kleppner called that rightly pietist imperialism for 80, 100 years. Constant attempts by pietists to outlaw liquor, Sunday rule laws, and outlaw parochial schools. Again, the Catholics and Lutherans are in favor of transmitting their culture and values to their children through parochial private school system. So now essentially what then happens is that the way this gets transmitted to national economic issues was this. Both the leadership of both parties, and again, it's pretty clear the Whigs were the pietist party, and then the Republicans were the pietist party, and the Democrats were the liturgical party. They transmit to their rank and file the following message. They say, look, the pietists say essentially as follows. Look, we need big government at home in order to save everybody and eliminate sin. The same way we need big government at the national level to keep out cheap foreigners. The attack on immigration, Kleppner shows pretty well, is not really an attack on all immigration. The pietists love Norwegian immigrants, for example. They hated those Catholic immigrants and Lutheran immigrants. An important point. It wasn't just nativeness. It was nativeness with a certain touch to it. And to keep out these cheap foreign people and keep out cheap foreign labor. And keep out cheap products of cheap foreign labor in the sense of cheap imports. And also the government should have public works and have cheap credit and expand people's purchasing power and so forth. In other words, the Whig Republican economic program was translated from the consciousness of the people of the pietists on a religious local level. The same way the Democratic leadership told their people, look, the same SOB wasps who are trying to take away your liquor, trying to take away your parochial schools, they're trying to take away your Sunday enjoyment. These same people are also using big government and paternalism on a national level to take away your cheap imports, to destroy the value of your savings through inflation and through bank credit expansion and through collective power. And so they made their point. So the passion of the people comes originally from their local religious issues and then gets expanded by political leadership to national economic questions. I think that's a fascinating point just in itself. Okay, so then you have essentially, with the exception of slavery, of course, there's a whole other question it's too late to go into at this point. And after the Civil War, this juncture becomes even clearer. The libertarian, laissez-faire Democrats versus the statist, pietist Republicans. What happens to change this? And again, as Kleppner points out, by the 1890s, the Democrats were winning out. For one thing, they were getting more, the liturgicals had more people, more babies than the pietists. And so you had, just by demographics, you had an increase in Democratic strength. The Democrats were becoming the majority party in the 1830s and 40s also, and was split by slavery, the slavery question. Van Buren and Jackson split on a question of admitting Texas as a slave state of the Union. But after the Civil War, there was no slavery problem anymore, and so this became much clearer. By the early 1890s, the Democrats were winning out. What then happened? What then destroyed this libertarian ideal? What basically happens is the Panic of 1893 politically destroys the Cleveland leadership, and Cleveland being the center of this laissez-faire part of the Democratic Party, destroys their leadership temporarily, leaves a power vacuum within the Democratic Party, be filled by the evil Bryan. Because Bryan, you see, concentrates in his very person, the antithesis of everything libertarian, and the antithesis of everything pietist. And interestingly enough, historians tend to think of, the good Bryan, who's the representative of the people against the interests and favor of free silver and all that. And The bad Brian is in favor of outlawing everything, including liquor and teachings of evolution. It's the same Brian. It's the same pietist Brian. It's always the same. And he always had the same views. He was a prohibitionist from the very beginning. At any rate, Brian is able to take over the Democratic Party in a fateful convention of 1896. How did he do it? Well, he did it basically by a Southwest alliance. The South is always the anomaly in this thing. The South, of course, is all pietist. So you had a pietist faction within the Democratic Party. And then you had the mountain states, these crummy new states which came in with no people, which were deliberately put in by the Republicans in order to expand the number of their free silver supporters in the Senate. And by this pietist alliance of South and mountain states, Brian was able to take over the convention and the party. And can you imagine what happened with anguish? Can you imagine the anguish of the liturgicals who found the party taken away from them? It was a real trauma. As Cleveland said a few years later, our party of our fathers is gone. Okay. This is the general theme. The Democrats have lost the liturgicals have lost their laissez-faire party. So what are they going to do? Well, some of them dropped out. And from then off, 1896 to the present, there's going to steady decline in voting rates, and turnout rates of voters, because people just became apathetic. The others shifted to the Republican Party, voted Republican for the first time in their lives. They were able to vote Republican because the Republicans were also experiencing an interesting change at the same time. The Mark Hanna-McKinley forces. McKinley was a very shrewd politician, not been given his due. They changed the Republican Party all in the 1890s to make it much more moderate and much more centrist. They kicked out the prohibitionists. They became sort of blah, something like the current Republican Democratic Party, the first blah party. And they also, another thing they did is they gave up on the gold question. The Republicans have always been a pro-silver inflationary force. So they decided to adopt the gold standard in 1896, and with a deal they made with the Morgan forces, and this then made them a party, essentially, a party we know since then. And so the Democrats were able to say, okay, at least they're pro-gold, even though they haven't given up the effective tariff, at least they're in favor of the gold standard. And so, at any rate, we then have Democrats collapsing as laissez-faire party, and this means the institutionalization of laissez-faire becomes obsolete. So you have this leaves a power vacuum. Again, as Klepper points out in a recent article, as a power vacuum which enables the progressive period to come in. In other words, enables the technocrats to take over. Because the political parties no longer become very important. People don't care about them anymore. There's not much of a choice anymore. As Bryan finally loses, and Wilson takes over. The two parties become indistinguishable in the way we know and love today. And so, as a result of this, the political parties become less and less important. And the progressive period, and we bring in now Cocoa analysis here, Weinstein and other people, progressive period is able to take over with technocracy and statism through administrative agencies, with Congress and political parties become much less important. And so this brings in the whole Cocoa-Weinstein analysis, which essentially, and I have to stop very soon, but essentially, analysis, which essentially is well, let's put it this way, the reason I prefer Cocoa to all the Williams people is simply this, what Cocoa, in contrast to the Marxists, realizes that it shows, empirically, that America is not becoming more monopolistic. American economy is not becoming more monopolistic in the late 19th century. On the contrary, what was happening was that various business interests, especially headed by the Morgans, were trying to achieve monopoly and couldn't do it in the free market. Even with a protective tariff put in by the Republicans to make their job easier for them, they couldn't do it. They tried through all sorts of cartels, they tried through mergers, try to have one firm in each industry, and in case after case, in each case, it flopped. It's really heroic, it's a beautiful testament to the free market of how these things flop. Morgan was the big railroad investor. He constantly tried to organize railroad cartels all during the 1860s and 70s, and they kept flopping. In 6 months, they were destroyed because of competition and secret price cutting. There's new railroads coming in. All these cartels failed, and so what? And so then the big railroad interests turned to the federal government to try to create the cartels for them, resulting in the Interstate Commerce Commission. And this is sort of the hallmark of harbinger, I should say, of the later progressive regulation. Well, the big business forces who were seeking monopoly in the late 19th century in the market and couldn't find it, and turned to the government to impose it, were up against an ideological or PR problem. Namely, the United States was built an anti-monopoly. There are many state constitutions which said monopoly is outlawed. What they meant by it, of course, was grants of monopoly privilege by the state. They didn't mean large firms and all that. But there's a great anti-monopoly tradition. How then is are these big business groups going to impose monopoly and cartel kind of institutions? How can they get away with it? They got away with it by claiming that they were anti-monopolistic. They did it in the name of anti-monopoly. It's a great shell game. To do this, they had to have intellectuals spinning out the apologetics. The ICC was supposed to be put in to curb big business and big railroad monopoly for the benefit of the people and the masses. This, of course, is the interpretation of historians all gave to the progressive period until about 15 years ago. That's what you read in all your high school textbooks. Progressive regulation came in because the people rose up, the workers and farmers and the progressive intellectuals, the social workers and whatever, economists rose up to curb business monopoly and use government to do this. This is the old shuck. And we see, I think, not just with cocoa, but a huge amount of literature and scholarship since then demonstrated just another reversible thing of this model that happened. What really happened was big business trying to achieve monopoly and free market and failing turned to the government to impose it in the name of anti-monopoly. Okay, so in the ICC, as McAvoy, I think it was, pointed out, the first thing the ICC did when they came into it was, first of all, to outlaw secret price cutting, which is the way cartels are broken from within. The second of all, to impose the high freight rates which the railroads were trying to get on the free market, which the Morgans tried to get and couldn't achieve on the market, using then the government, the ICC, to impose it. So we see then the railroads, or government regulation in general is a cartelizing device. Insurance regulation is a cartelizing device to keep out low rate, low premium firms, and on, just in every aspect of American life. Now, in order to do this, as I say, you had to have, well, and as Weinstein points out, how the big business opinion is expressed through the National Civic Federation led the way in this. And interestingly enough, National Civic Federation people said we have two basic enemies. The socialists on our left, or the Marxists on our left, and what they call the anarchists of the NAM, the National Association of Manufacturers, on their right. The NAM wouldn't have called themselves anarchists, but this is an expression of the old laissez-faire viewpoint, at least to a large extent. But we see at that point, the laissez-faire people had no institutional expression. There's no party left. There's no Democratic Party. There's no ideologists, no party ideologists. And also, of course, laissez-faire intellectuals were dying out. They're literally dying out. I mean, the last great expression of laissez-faire intellectuals, something many of you might not know, was the Anti-Imperialist League, formed in 1898 and 1900 to oppose the Spanish-American War, particularly our war of conquest of the Philippines, the first great anti-guerrilla war which we engaged in. The Anti-Imperialist League was almost all elderly, laissez-faire abolitionists in the 70s and 80s, headed by Edward Atkinson of Boston. And they were very militant. I mean, they were extremely gutsy. Atkins, for example, wrote a pamphlet to our soldiers in the Philippines, urging them to mutiny. It's pretty gutsy stuff, even for the anti-Vietnam War expression. And this pamphlet is confiscated by the post office, one of the great expressions of efficiency in carrying the mail. And they were talking about trying, Atkinson for sedition or treason or whatever. They didn't do it because he was a very well-known figure and an important political figure. But essentially, that was the last expression of laissez-faire intellectual opinion. We then have a growing group of intellectuals, technocrats, PhDs. PhD was a new thing coming in from Germany. Economists, social workers, sociologists, historians, engineers, all this tremendous growth of professionalization and organization in America, all of whom want a piece of the pie. If you read some of this stuff, it's interesting. If you read some of these guys, the head of the National Association of Civic Engineers, whatever the name was, we are engineers and we have a complex economy and therefore engineers should run the country. That sort of thing. They're quite blatant about it. The science of public relations hadn't really been invented yet, and so they were pretty forthright. And so you had one of the fascinating things about the progressive period is the forthrightness of these people. They're physicians becoming organized medicine. It's endless. I'm trying to write a book on the progressive period. The book keeps receding into the future as I find new horrors. I mean, the physicians, psychiatrists, and everybody's in there trying to grab power and wealth. To keep out, first of all, to monopolize their profession, to keep out, interlopers, to raise their income, and then to achieve political power. Physicians through the Flexner Report, state monopolization of medicine, psychiatrists, their ideology, and as a whole, I mean, just as I say, just endless, and most of it hasn't been studied until very recently, except as hagiographical purposes, how great these guys were. I mean, real studies have been only come in the last few years. A friend of mine has written a definitive article on psychiatric views of anti-sex laws. By the way, anti-sex laws, before he wrote his article, it was assumed by historians that anti-sex laws continued from Puritan period until now, until the 1920s. Actually, there were almost no anti-sex laws before about the 1880s, before the onset of progressivism. The age of consent was 10, the old common law age of consent. And from one thing, there's almost nothing was illegal. And then the progressives come in, the doctors, the psychiatrists, the health authorities, the caring professions that they're called. They come in and start outlawing everything. And in the name of hygiene, in the name of morality. And what you essentially have, as a matter of fact, is a professionalization of the pietist impulse. In other words, you have these instead of, it became less fashionable to talk about outlawing everything in the name of, outlawing sin in the name of religion. Became more fashionable outlaws in the name of science, health, hygiene, etc. But essentially the same people doing the same things. The paradigmatic cases, usually these doctors and psychiatrists were born as pietists and then went to college and dropped their faith and became do-gooders and power lusters. So it's sort of a secularization of the old pietist impulse. It's very interesting. I have a little paper here on Harvey Wiley, which I was going to read. I'm getting kind of late, but Harvey Wiley was the founder of the Pure Food and Drug Act. It's fascinating to show what he was about. I got this purely from a hagiographical biography of Wiley, the only one in existence. It's pretty clear the guy was a secularized pietist, one outlaw. He also, in addition to that, is also in league with the sugar interests. So half of his life is devoted to outlawing the compulsory purity, a very peculiar definition of purity. The other half of his life, and conjoined with it, was the subsidization of sugar and the keeping out of all foreign sugar. So it's kind of it's kind of fascinating, sort of a paradigmatic case of modern power-seeking intellectuals. At any rate, so you have that, and it's true through history, by the way. You have a problem through history. The state is always run by a minority group, minority ruling class. How are they going to get the public to go along with this? And this is true of Oriental despotism, it's true of the Incas, whatever, of absolute monarchs. How are they going to get the public to swallow all this stuff that's coming down their pike? The taxes and the wars and the conscription and all the rest of it. How are they going to get them to obey? It's what Jim Burnham called the mystery of civil obedience. Okay, now, why do people obey the state? Burnham's answer is we obey because we have to obey, because it's there. If you don't have a mystical view of the state, your answer might be a little bit different. But the kings found from early on, the way to get the public to swallow that power and improve it is to ally themselves with the intellectuals. This is the great concept of the court intellectual. Before the 18th century or so, the intellectuals were almost always priests or ministers. And so the alliance of church and state was an important one because it meant that both filling certain important functions politically. The church told the people, you have to obey the state. The state is divine even. The state has divine sanction. You must obey the state. And the state collected taxes to support the church. Okay, so it was a beautiful alliance. It was a very, very cozy situation. The only people suffering was the general public. And what we essentially have coming in with a progressive period was a new form of state-church alliance, a new marriage of throne and altar. Except now the throne wasn't the king; it's now the president and Congress and whatever, and the bureaucrats. And the church the church includes ministers and so forth. The social gospel is essentially doing the same thing it's still in favor of prohibition, except now saying it's now socially important, in addition to just fundamentally important. But also mostly secularized in the form of, as I say, engineers, physicians, economists, and whatever. All looking for power and all using the common good as the excuse. Some of these guys, by the way, Jim Gilbert, an excellent book called Designing the Industrial State, he deals with what he calls the collectivist intellectuals in this period. And one of the chapters on Charles Steinmetz is a fascinating figure. He was a brilliant inventor. He was he was a major theoretician for General Electric. He was a major inventor and theoretician. He was also a socialist. And his form of socialism is what Gilbert called General Electric socialism. Essentially what he advocated was there should be one company ruling the world, essentially General Electric. Steinmetz obviously sort of at least being the theoretician for General Electric. So as I say, people were much franker in those days about the goals in which they saw. So, and I think it's also no coincidence that the progressive were extremely racist. I mean, I'm not saying that in a sense everybody was racist in this period. The progressives were particularly racist. They believed in compulsory racism from the government. imperialist foreign policy comes in with progressives also. It's just a great can of worms, the marvelous integral doctrine which they pursued. When Teddy Roosevelt, when the Progressive Party was founded in 1912, Teddy Roosevelt, the founding convention, the New York Times reporter said, "My God, look, it seems like a religious camp revival meeting. It doesn't seem like a political convention." They were singing hymns all the time. They would break into the speeches with hymns. They would shout "Amen." It was and so you had this great marriage of essentially these people were either social workers, economists, progressive, and extremely religious, pietist oriented. Teddy Roosevelt, their helm. And as a matter of fact, Teddy Roosevelt, his own person, I think, almost embodied the whole progressive spirit in almost every aspect. There's a great review in Inquiry magazine of the new book on Teddy Roosevelt by Morris. Review is by Walter Lefebvre. It's a marvelous, beautifully written review, which I commend to your attention. It's about 6 months ago. The first paragraph, something like this, I wish I brought it here, something like, Theodore Roosevelt shouted with joy when he killed his first buffalo. He shouted with joy when he killed his first Indian. It goes on and on and on. Every sentence is kill. Shouted with joy when he killed his first Spaniard. So it's a great, it's a litany of it. Something out there. Well, there's kill, kill, kill. Anyway, okay, it's getting very late. I think you see I think I've succeeded in eliminating at least the new paradigm in American history. The Balin, Maine, Kleppner, and Coco all woven into this picture. And if anybody wants to ask questions, I'm happy to. Sorry, folks, so long. It's difficult to present a whole paradigm in American history in less than this.
Do you think you could perhaps carry it briefly into the 20th century?
Well, this is okay. All right, I'll continue on. Interestingly enough, when I gave this similar address at the University of Oregon for historians, mostly graduate students, they're pretty unsympathetic about all of this stuff until I got to the current period, when they were cheering it on. They're much more willing to entertain so-called conspiracy analysis about Carter, for example, than they were about Teddy Roosevelt. Anyway, might say something. Anyway, well, I should. Okay, if you want to carry on, I should say something about them. If people really want me to, I can. I should say something about the Morgan-Rockefeller connection. It's extremely important. The Democratic Party, from about 1870s on, the early 20s and 30s, was essentially a Morgan-dominated party. And this not necessarily bad from a libertarian point of view, because they were originally fairly libertarian in their outlook. But on the other hand, they started shifting by late 19th century, and I think instrumental in driving the Democratic Party in a progressive direction. I don't think it's an accident, for example, the Progressive Party was the national chairman of the Progressive Party, certainly its leading figure was George W. Perkins, who was a Morgan partner of the House of Morgan. As a matter of fact, you find Morgan partners everywhere in strategically located positions. It's really amazing. The Cleveland cabinet, a lot of Morgan partners. And Cleveland himself became a Morgan lawyer after he left the presidency. Indeed, he was one before that. He was a Buffalo Railroad lawyer. So you have a Morgan connection constantly going on. Morgan and Henry Cabot Lodge, the Lodge family, always wrapped up in the Morgans. And essentially, the Lodge McKinley détente in 1896 was essentially a Morgan Rockefeller détente. I'll say in a minute. When Teddy Roosevelt, I think it's pretty clear that Teddy Roosevelt was essentially a Morgan person throughout. It's the famous Northern Security case, which seems like an exception to that, but I think Coco has shown pretty well that it really wasn't. Because you wind up with after the whole national security suit is undertaken, you wind up with the Morgans really winning out over the Harrimans and their supposed allies in the Northern Security holding company. At any rate, the Morgans were a powerful, of course, financial group. And they were the driving element behind the National Civic Federation and the progressivization of business leadership. Not only was Perkins, Morgan partner, chairman of the Progressive Party, also the New Republic. To me, the New Republic symbolizes the big business statist intellectual alliance, almost from its inception to the present day, as a matter of fact, right down to it. But from its inception, The New Republic was founded, edited by three brilliant progressive intellectuals, Walter Lippmann, Walter Weil, and Herbert Crowley. Crowley particularly was, like, to me, is a personification of evil. I shouldn't say evil, it's an actual word. I mean, anti-libertarian in almost every aspect of his life. Crowley and Weil was much better. Now, the interesting thing, so we know about Crowley, Lippmann, and Weil being been studied almost ad nauseam by historians, but what hasn't been studied so much was who founded, who owned the Republic, who set it up. That was Willard Straight, Morgan partner. Now, either you have to say, you see Morgan all over the place, he's pushing these progressive things. Either you have to say, there only seems to be two explanations. One, that they had a self-destructive impulse, and they just wanted cutting their own throat all the time. Or else it seems to be a fairly implausible explanation. Or else they're really trying to, before they accomplish something for their own ends by pushing progressivism, which I think is a much more likely scenario. As I say, Teddy Roosevelt was almost completely Morgan from the very inception. He was married. His first wife was related to the Cabots and Lowells, were Morgan-oriented, and so forth, and so on and on. On the other hand, you had the Republican Party, which was essentially dominated by the Rockefeller family from 1870 on. If you look at the number of presidents, the presidential candidates, for example, Republican Party, at least half of them in this period from Ohio. You know, the whole group of them, Hayes, and not Harris, Hayes and Garfield, and McKinley, and Taft, and Harding, all these people from Ohio. And why is Ohio the big state? Why does all these nominees come from Ohio? Why? The usual explanation is, well, it was an important state. Well, of course it was an important state, but there's lots of other important states. Why didn't they get their share of the pie? Where was Illinois ever since Lincoln? The hypothesis here is, it seems to me, that Ohio was dominant in the Republican Party because Ohio was essentially a Rockefeller party. Rockefeller was stationed most of his life, certainly his early years, in Cleveland. His refinery was in Cleveland. His pipelines were from Western Pennsylvania. His base was in Cleveland, and essentially he dominated the Republican Party of Ohio. He was also a pietist. Mark Hanna, the head of the Republican Party of Ohio for many years, was an industrialist. Coal and industrialist, and who was economically in business with Rockefeller, as well as being an old friend of his from high school. As a matter of fact, a lot of high school chums of Rockefeller suddenly pop up in important positions. You could say it's a coincidence, you see. You could say, well, no, it's just a coincidence that all these guys were high school chums of Rockefeller. On the other hand, I was, I mean, my grandfather, remember, wasn't a high school chum of Rockefeller. He didn't have any position of power. So, anyway, in other words, sometimes when you look at all this stuff, what I mean to say is, when you look at all these interconnections, you get the feeling that everybody's related to the Morgans and Rockefeller, but everybody isn't. Just put it in perspective. Anyway, so we have that, and we know that Mark Hanna was Rockefeller's big mentor. I mean, McKinley's big mentor. McKinley was bailed out of bankruptcy by Hanna. And so the Hanna-Rockefeller direction, McKinley direction, was essentially Rockefeller direction. Okay, in 1900, Rockefeller was essentially dominant because the Republican Party was dominant, except for the Cleveland administration. In 1900, shortly after the McKinley election, a lone nut appears in the American scene, and McKinley is bumped off, fortuitously bringing to power Morgans, person Teddy Roosevelt. One of the first things Teddy Roosevelt does, he starts using an instrument which had been totally dead up to then, the Sherman Antitrust Act. Now, nothing has been done so far. No revisionist work has been done on the origins of the Sherman Antitrust Act. It's sort of completely, Cocoa hasn't done anything on it. None of the Cocoa people have done anything on it. It's a virgin territory to look at. So, anyway, there was a dead letter. It hadn't been used. And mergers were being formed older in the late 1890s with no thought whatsoever about corporate lawyers, no worry about the Sherman Act. All of a sudden, Teddy Roosevelt takes this rusted weapon out of his arsenal and starts using it with a vengeance. Against whom? He used it against Standard Oil. He said he's not against all trusts, he's against only the bad trusts. The bad trusts will somehow all happen to be Rockefeller, and the good trusts were Morgan. Now, the good trusts were U.S. Steel and International Harvester. Right? So, now, the interesting thing, and here I get to the realm of pure speculation, being much more speculative than I've been saying up till now. Why was this essential harmony between Rockefellers and Morgans? They were quarreling about the tariff and all that, but essentially, there wasn't this bitter. You didn't use an antitrust weapon. That's not playing the rule. That's not playing the game by the rules. That's really getting dirty. Why did Teddy Roosevelt break the rules? Why did he suddenly do this? I say this is pure speculation. It seems to me it might be a connection between that, the fact that 2 or 3 years previously they launched a big international oil war between Royal Dutch Shell on one hand and Standard Oil on the other, ranging all over the world looking for oil resources. Royal Dutch Shell was essentially Rothschild-oriented, organized by Rothschild. And Rothschilds and Morgans had definite connections. So is it possible that the savage attack on Standard Oil was launched because, as an aid to try to cripple the Standard Oil on behalf of the Morgans and their Rothschild allies? I say this is pure speculation. It's never been investigated. This line of thought has never been even raised. See, it's all put down to some of the nutty aspects of Roosevelt's psyche. But I mean, I'll be the first one to grant his nutty aspects of his psyche. But I don't think that's a sufficient explanation. At any rate, Teddy Roosevelt is succeeded by Taft, a higher Republican, and therefore allied with Rockefellers. Taft is even more so-called conservative, even more antitrust oriented. He usually uses the antitrust weapons fairly well, particularly against who? Against U.S. Steel and the National Harvester. In other words, against the Morgans, the Morgan companies, which presumably launched the attack on Standard Oil. So we have then, it seems to be easy to interpret the Taft administration as essentially the Rockefellers' revenge on the Morgans. Okay, now the Morgans got really hopped up. They're not used to this kind of treatment, and they launched the Progressive Party, and just purely, it seems to me pretty clearly, to smash Taft, make sure he's not reelected, and Teddy Roosevelt is the presidential candidate. So we have a Morgan attempt to smash Taft. Of all the big business groups, John D. Rockefeller was almost the only one to support Taft for re-election in 1912. Everybody else was in this time the Morgan camp. Woodrow Wilson had ties with the Morgan camp also, and so this seems to be pretty much of a setup. I mean, pretty clear direction in which this was going. We come now to World War I, which is, as Weinstein says, the culmination of the progressive impulse. Because World War I, you can't imagine how they loved World War I. They loved it. Boy, did they love it. By that, I don't mean the people who died in World War I. I mean the big business, big unions who are now coming in, fostered by government, so-called responsible unions, that is, and intellectuals running the economy and the society. Boy, do they love it. Can't imagine. The joy of World War I was something to behold. The economists were finally reached their apogee. They're out there planning the economy. Historians were out there telling lies about Germany, German culture, and they're all participating in the war effort one way or the other, and they loved it. And big business finally found, but monopoly really works, cartelization works. They cartelize every part of the economy, every aspect of it. It's very cozy for them. They have, for example, a steel industry section as part of the War Planning Board, War Industry Board, rather. And the steel section would be headed by steel industrialists, who then would be negotiating with steel industry representatives, who would also be steel industrialists, usually from the same firms. They come to very cozy conclusions, with fixing prices, fixing production. And boy, do they love it. And they want to continue this after the war as a peacetime mode. And indeed, after that, all the politicians, for one thing, for some reason, they were all very young. Maybe in different revolutionary periods of radical change, youth comes to the fore in politics. But all these guys were pretty young. They stayed to plague us for about 50 years. Bernard Baruch, Franklin Roosevelt, all these people originated in World War I. Basically, they started out. They had their initial Herbert Hoover. All these people were mostly all friends, and mostly all thought alike. Even though later days we didn't realize it until fairly late. There's a whole raft of them, there's dozens of them all over the place, and they were a self-conscious team. Their idea was to bring back to American society the joy that we had in World War I, the same sort of institutions, the same sort of collectivized society, same sort of militarism. Another aspect of this, of course, is militarism, world war, and global crusading. All this, of course, is tied in together. They basically succeeded in doing it. And when the New Deal comes in, first in the Hoover administration and then the Roosevelt administration, the same institutions get resurrected. For example, the War Finance Corporation, which is at the end of World War I to try to bail out bankrupt businesses. Headed by Eugene Meyer, who's also connected with the Morgans personally. When Hoover comes in and puts in the Reconstruction Finance Corporation in 1932, the name has changed from war to Reconstruction. the same Eugene Meyer is heading it, the same office is being used in Washington, because the organization continued on even 12 years after the war, because no government agency ever really died. You have to really kill it. It never dies on its own. Always pegs along, ready to be resurrected. The same officers, the same secretary, the same people, the same staff, uses the nucleus for expansion. And then World War II, the same thing happens again on a much greater scale. And the same, almost the same people are being used, because they started off pretty young in World War I. They say there's an attempt by most of these guys to continue the war, collectivized war effort, war production, war industry board as a permanent part of the peace structure. It was beaten largely because Senator Newton Baker, Secretary Newton Baker was a sort of a semi-laissez-faire type, thought this was going too far, and persuaded Wilson to scuttle it. But ever since then, people, Hoover, Baruch, Roosevelt, looked back to World War I as sort of the great paradigm. Rex Tugwell, the famous Roosevelt brain fuster, wrote during the 1920s, wistfully about World War I. He said, if only the war could have continued a couple more years, we could have had full socialism in the United States. Sort of socialism we're talking about, of course, was war socialism, or whatever we want to have the name we want to use for it. Anyway, that sort of brings me up to date.
Okay. We have about 15 minutes for questions.
Thank you. Yeah.
Does this tie in with the recent researchers attempt to link Rockefeller, Rothschild, and Morgan, particularly the Rockefellers, with the more Marxist-oriented socialism later to the Russian Revolution?
I don't think so. I think that's pretty bizarre because, see, for one thing, it's true the various Wall Street bankers loan money to the Bolsheviks. On the other hand, they loan money to everybody. It's their business to lend money. So the fact that you lend money to somebody doesn't necessarily mean you're tied in with them politically. So most of the evidence is very flimsy. It's that sort of very slight evidence.
Conjecture.
Yeah, but the conjecture doesn't make too much sense. See, one of the things which give a conspiracy analysis a bad name is the fact that it's used with sort of with a meat cleaver instead of with a scalpel. See, the tendency is to lump all the bad guys together in one big group. You know? That's the bad conspiracy analysis. You don't like a whole bunch of people. You see a bunch of people competing for power. So you don't like them. You say there must be some central organization somewhere which pushes a button and say, okay, you pretend to fight him because I will confuse everybody. Actually, it doesn't work that way. For one thing, just logistically, it doesn't work because if you tell you to fight you and pretend to do it, you usually wind up doing it for real. And the so-called manipulator doesn't know whether it's for real or not. So for various reasons, including that one, it just doesn't work. The world doesn't work that way. What really happens is there's a whole bunch of competing, whole different power sources of people wanting to achieve power, a whole bunch of different groups. And sometimes they're in coalition, sometimes they're competing. It all depends. So it's like the world in general. Like nations sometimes coalesce and compete. So the idea is one group, 12 guys somewhere pushing all the buttons is really pretty weird.
The question is libertarian comments that was going on in Parliament.
Okay, yeah.
Do you think this libertarian comments was going on in Parliament?
Oh. Well, I haven't got any real words of particular wisdom on this. I just don't want to see a war launched, that sort of thing. The thing that really worries me is the general attitude of the American public. Well, I can see it. Like the college students, public in general, nuke them, and camel jockeys go home, and all sorts of other more obscene expressions of attacks on Iranians per se. The moves to deport Iranian students and all that sort of thing. So that's a very ugly situation. You can see that it also indicates to me not all wars are launched by. I think it's a cause for nuking everybody. It's an important thing.
Most wars weren't so.
Beg pardon?
Most wars did.
Well, see, the thing about this was, even a friend of mine is very nice, one of the theoreticians of non-interventionism in the favor of war here, he says that the sort of legalistic ground, the embassy of American soil, and therefore attack on America, that's kind of a very legalistic way of looking at it. It's a sort of legal fiction that's American soil. It's really, of course, that's Iranian soil. So, that's sort of kind of bizarre. And it seems to me that the best way to release the hostages is just sort of quiet diplomacy. It's sort of Andy Carter was doing too badly. I'm afraid what he'll be pushed into, though, by the public. That's what I think kind of worries me. And of course, bombing is not going to release the hostages, obviously. clear. But another problem is when you're looking at war as if it's some kind of police action. Most of the American public say, oh, they're evil, they've done criminal things, and therefore they should be punished. As if you're dealing with people down the block if somebody sees the building. It's not the same situation. Even when you have people seizing the building, you don't punish them if innocent people are killed at the same time. In other words, supposing you see some guy's a criminal, he's stolen, just killed somebody or just stolen, robbed a bank or something, and you see him running down the street. You don't take a machine gun and spray the street where other people are walking. And so it's very important, it seems to me, from a libertarian viewpoint or any other viewpoint, not to kill innocent people when you're doing your so-called punishing. In an international situation, you're punishing Iranians or anybody else, you always be killing innocent people. It's inevitable. And so that's why libertarians tend to be very non-interventionist. One of the basic reasons.
Yeah. On your point about the Bill of Rights being sort of a coup d'etat, granted,
Constitution.
with Madison as an opportunist, I find that interesting because most people usually think of Hamilton as being the amoral.
Well, Hamilton was pure evil, no question about that. he was so far out, he couldn't have done it himself. So he needed an ally.
I'm wondering, is there any case for giving a benefit of the doubt or was he giving the game away when he wrote his paper about why we didn't need a Bill of Rights? Because a curious thing did happen. What he predicted, more or less, did come down in a court decision. He said, we say, for instance, that the freedom of the press shall not be abridged. Someday, someone will argue with a semblance of reason that the government was supposed to decide what freedom of the press is and whether it should be abridged or not. As a matter of fact, Black handed down a decision like that in one of the Ginsburg cases.
No, that was a shuck on his part. He
was giving the game away.
Oh yeah. The thing is, the anti-federalists are not just in favor of Bill of Rights, they're against any kind of monopoly Supreme Court. The concept of a monopoly Supreme Court doing the ultimate interpretation really comes in with Marshall. Marshall's a lame duck Supreme Court justice who comes in and appointed the last day or whatever it is of Adams's reign and lives, unfortunately, about 80 years, it seems, to rewrite the whole Constitution. I mean, originally, there's nothing in the Constitution that says the Supreme Court has the ultimate power to sign anything. So, in fact, it doesn't even mention the Supreme Court, as far as I remember. So that's really a sort of a second coup d'etat. As Calhoun pointed out, great state. I recommend everybody, a great book by Calhoun called Disquisition on Government, came out in 1831. A marvelous little book, where he says, if you have a constitution, and then you have a monopoly government institution with the power to interpret the Constitution, you've had it. Because what's going to happen is, inevitably, the majority of the guys in power, the Supreme Court is part of the government. The guys in power are going to expand the power. They have broad construction of the power of government. The guys out of power will call for strict construction. They're going to lose because they're going to be out of power. And so eventually you're going to have a general trend toward total despotism. So he was right.
One chance in my follow-up question was the so-called embodiment that Mill enjoyed so much in the Constitution, separation of powers, constitutional checks and balances. Would you agree that overall it's more or less an illusion?
Yeah, that's the checks and balances, separation of power. That was the Montesquieu shuck. Montesquieu was the other conservatives, which I mean statists, in the 18th century, looking at Montesquieu as the model rather than Locke or Cato's letters. The idea is you have one, it's all right, you have the executive arm and the judicial arm and the legislative arm, they all check and balance each other. But largely, it's really, it's to a very minor extent they do it. Usually it's a scam because it's all the government. A real check and balance would be, say, if the 1898, the principles of 1898, say if New York had nullified federal law which applies in New York, that would be a check and balance. Say. Or if you turn to some other government within the United States and say, that's the U.S. government, I support the Metropolitan Protection Agency. That would be a real check and balance. But the other stuff is real phony. It's pretty clear. Yeah.
What you mentioned that after the Wyatt candidates say that the rise of progressivism, the laissez-faire radical individualist tradition became totally paralyzed, became drawn into a conservative rear guard action to preserve what they already had. What prevented the aggressive counterattack, like you mentioned, Edward Atkins, regrouping into a new party, a constitutional party, a laissez-faire party, a libertarian party, and sort of pulling a new Martin Van Buren Buren and Andrew Jackson in the 20th century, or was it just that they were old and really didn't have that much new blood coming in at that point?
That's probably it. The latter, I imagine. The trend was against them. They were dying out. Don't forget, when Van Buren did it was done with most of the American public really believing in the ideology. By early 1900s, it didn't seem to be the other way. And maybe they could have pulled it off, but nobody, as far as I know, nobody even attempted it.
This goes back to the very beginning of your speech, and also your recent Viewpoint article in Reason magazine, where you talked about libertarianism being a purely political philosophy. You mentioned that the two, liberty versus power, would be social power versus state power. And the fact that you brought up that religion was such a strong leader and direction of the politics in the 18th, 19th century. It seems to me that there was a strong cultural stream that was directing political thought, and that there seemed to be a stronger relationship between libertarianism or non-libertarianism from a cultural point of view, and not just a political point of view.
Well, there's no question about the fact that culture influences politics. I'm not denying that at all. Just that libertarianism per se is a political philosophy. There are all sorts of influences on it, no question about it. I'm not trying to deny that. Also, there are all sorts of social philosophies that people can have that can make them more libertarian, that tend to make them more libertarian. It's just that the actual technical doctrine, so to speak, is just purely political. So you can have all sorts of different moral views or no views at all, religious views, and still be libertarian or not be libertarian. But it's true that sociologically, so to speak, you can have there might be specific cultural aspects which would tend to make people more libertarian. And what they are, I don't really know particularly. I know about the 19th century, and it's something to really investigate.
Tying this into this question, the last 30 years, if I'm not mistaken, have seen the rise of a rather peculiar, peculiarly disjointed conflux of sympathies with so-called liberals or progressives supporting a certain, the pietist you referred to, supporting a considerable range in the area of what might be called civil liberties, while being fanatically antagonistic on freedom of action in the economic area, and the advocates of greater freedom of action in the economy being similarly fanatical and puritanical and just plain, fascistic in the civil liberties area. Do you have any idea of how this developed?
I'm not sure. The thing is, you don't have to be. If you're a pietist, you don't have to be a statist. Just historically, it's the truth of what happened.
I know, it's just a peculiar association, but it's...
You could take a view, such as the Southern pietists tended to take, that each individual is responsible for his own salvation, period, not for other people's. They'll tend to make you more individualistic politically. This is Kleppner has in his new book, which I haven't had a chance to read completely yet. But I don't know, it's an interesting thing, because I say the liturgicals were laissez-faire in economics and in personal values until the 1900s. Yeah. Liturgicals now still tend to be a little bit more civil liberties oriented, a little bit. And the pietists tend to be a little bit more free market. But I don't know how he rose. It's a good question. Kleppner himself was his next book was going to deal with the post-1900 period. Maybe we'll reveal some stuff on that. But that's a very good question.
Would it tie in with the kind of corporate society envisioned in the New Republic with different factions of welfare socialism, or even that wouldn't answer?
I think I'll have to cut this off. I'm very sorry. I'd like to thank Professor Rothbard. And the history department.